My name is Brynn Hartley, and I'm 34 years old the day I signed that paper. I had no idea I was giving up everything that mattered to me. I still remember the smell of rain that morning, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes the world feel smaller. My kitchen window was fogged, and I was staring at it while my daughter Ella was braiding her doll's hair, and Mason was scribbling on a cereal box. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. After the divorce, I had learned to survive on less money, less help, less sleep, but I had more peace than I ever did with Carter. Or so I thought. That morning, the phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something in me always answered anyway. "Mrs. Hartley?" a smooth voice said. "This is Jordan Fields from Cascade Realty. We're finalizing the documents regarding your late father's property." My heart stuttered. My father's property, 5 acres of land outside town, was the only piece of him left after he passed. "Oh," I said, clutching the receiver. "Is there a problem?" "Nothing major," he replied. "We just need your signature on a confirmation form. It's standard procedure to keep the records up to date." I didn't question it. Maybe because I wanted to believe everything was simple for once. Maybe because I trusted anything that sounded official. Or maybe because the kids were arguing over crayons, and my brain could only handle one problem at a time. He emailed me the document and told me, "If you sign quickly, we can close this out today." Those words, "sign quickly," didn't mean much at the time. They sounded like convenience, not danger. I printed the papers, skimmed the first few lines, and scribbled my name where he'd highlighted in yellow. My father's name sat above mine on the page, and for a brief second, I smiled. It felt like a final connection to him. That evening, I made spaghetti, the cheap kind that sticks together, and we watched a movie in the living room. For a few hours, I forgot about the papers. When I tucked the kids into bed, Ella asked, "Mom, are we going to see Grandpa's farm soon?" "Soon," I promised, brushing her hair back. "It's ours now." But promises can turn to lies in the time it takes for ink to dry. The next morning, I was pouring coffee when I heard a knock at the door. A man in a suit stood there, holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Hartley?" "Yes, I'm here on behalf of Carter Development," he said, handing me a notice. "You're required to vacate the property within 30 days. I blinked, my stomach twisting. "Vacate? What property?" "The Hartley land. The deed transfer is complete." The words hit me like a fist. "No, there's a mistake." He pointed to the bottom of the paper. My signature. My handwriting. My name. I felt the air leave my lungs. My fingers trembled as I read the lines that said I had transferred full ownership to Carter Hartley, my ex-husband. "That's impossible," I whispered. "I would never. It's all here, ma'am." He tipped his hat politely and left me standing in the doorway, clutching a piece of paper that had just stolen my life. I sank to the floor, the coffee still dripping behind me. My kids peeked around the corner, confused by my silence. I couldn't explain to them that I had just signed away the only thing their grandfather had left us. I drove to the county office that afternoon, still hoping someone could tell me it was an error. The woman at the desk didn't even look up from her screen when she said, "If it's signed and filed, it's final." Final. The word echoed in my chest like a verdict. I called the lawyer who'd handled my father's estate, the same one who'd recommended Carter's associate for help. He told me to calm down, that these things happened. "You shouldn't have signed without reading," he said, like it was that simple. The drive home was a blur. I couldn't even cry. My mind replayed the moment I'd scrawled my name, how rushed I felt, how careless it seemed in hindsight. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Carter's truck parked across the street. He leaned against it, arms folded, wearing that smug half-smile I used to mistake for charm. "You really should have read the fine print, Brynn," he said. My body went cold. "You tricked me," I spat. "You used my father's death. You gave it to me," he interrupted. "Legally, willingly, all tied up with a bow." He walked away, leaving tire marks in the gravel like scars. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the table staring at the document until dawn crept through the blinds. I'd lost the land, the inheritance, the last piece of my father's legacy, all because I trusted too easily. Ella woke up and saw me sitting there, eyes red. "Mom," she said softly, "are we okay?" I forced a smile I didn't feel. "We will be," I said, though even I didn't believe it. But deep down, something was changing. The woman who signed that paper had been naive, desperate to believe in fairness. The one who stared at it now was something else entirely. I didn't just sign a paper, I signed away my family's last piece of home. At first, I thought it was some mistake. Nobody could take my father's land that easily. The next morning, I woke up with a pit in my stomach that felt heavier than any hangover of heartbreak. I packed Ella and Mason into the car and drove straight to the county clerk's office. The building smelled like dust and disappointment. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the folder that held the eviction notice. "I need to see someone about a property transfer," I said to the clerk behind the glass. She didn't even blink, just handed me a form to fill out. After 20 minutes of typing and searching, she printed a sheet and slid it through the window. "Here's your deed record." I took one look and felt the blood drain from my face. My signature was there, bold, clean, deliberate. Underneath, in black and white, it read, "Transferee, Carter L. Hartley." "That can't be right," I whispered. The clerk shrugged. "It's legally filed. Looks like it was notarized, too." "Who notarized it?" "Jordan Fields." The name hit me like a slap. The smooth voice on the phone, the man who said to sign quickly. He wasn't from Cascade Realty, he worked for Carter. My head spun. "He lied," I said, gripping the counter. "He said it was a confirmation form." The clerk frowned slightly, but her tone stayed detached. "If you signed it, ma'am, it's binding." I stumbled outside, the papers fluttering in the wind, and sat on the cold concrete steps. My hands were numb, my chest tight. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. Ella tugged on my sleeve. "Mom, what's wrong?" I couldn't tell her that her mother had just handed their home to the man who broke her. When I got back to the house, there were two men in hard hats marking the yard with orange flags. "What are you doing?" I yelled. "Surveying for demolition," one replied casually. "Construction starts next month. You'll need to vacate before then." "This is private property," I shouted, though the words felt hollow now. "Not anymore," he said, not unkindly. He pointed at the stake in the ground. "Owner's Carter Hartley. Orders came from him." My blood boiled so hard I could taste metal. Carter had been planning this long before I signed anything. He must have waited. Knowing I was tired. Knowing I wouldn't question him if things looked official. I stormed into the house and called him. He answered on the second ring. His tone smug. "Well, if it isn't my favorite ex-wife, how's my property treating you?" "You tricked me," I hissed. "You stole it." "You gave it to me, Brynn. You should have read before you signed. You always did trust too easily." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles ached. "You won't get away with this." "Oh, but I already have," he said, and hung up. That night, I couldn't eat. The kids sat quietly, sensing the tension even if they didn't understand it. I walked from room to room, touching the walls, the furniture, the framed photos. Everything suddenly felt temporary, borrowed. Around midnight, I went outside and stood in the yard. The swing set swayed in the wind, the same one my father had built for Ella when she was 2. It had been his last gift before he died. Now it had a red flag tied to it, marking it for removal. Something in me snapped. I picked up the flag and tore it off, my fingers bleeding from the splintered wood. "This is my home," I whispered into the darkness. "You can't take this from me." But even as I said it, I knew the law didn't care about whispered truths. The next morning, I went to a local attorney's office, a small brick building sandwiched between a laundromat and a bakery. The receptionist looked at me with pity when I explained what happened. "Do you have the document?" she asked. I handed it over. She flipped through the pages, her expression tightening. "It's airtight," she said. "Whoever drafted this knew what they were doing." You signed over full ownership rights and forfeited future claims. But I didn't know what I was signing. Unless you can prove coercion or fraud, it's legally binding. My breath came out in short, panicked bursts. So that's it? He just gets away with it? She sighed. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hartley. Without solid evidence, there's not much we can do. I left the office feeling smaller than I ever had before. Outside, the sun was bright and cruel. I drove back home, every mile feeling like a countdown. When I pulled up, Carter's men were already unloading fencing materials. One of them waved politely, as if this were just business. I wanted to scream until the sky cracked. Instead, I went inside, locked the door, and slid down the wall. Ella and Mason huddled beside me, their eyes wide. Mom, are we gonna lose Grandpa's land? Mason asked, his little voice breaking. I swallowed hard. Not if I can help it. But even as I said it, my voice trembled. That night, I sat at the kitchen table again, staring at the document that had ruined everything. My father's name, my signature, Carter's triumph, it was all there, mocking me. I thought about the lawyer's words, about the county clerk's indifference, about Carter's smug laugh. I had been naive, but I wasn't stupid. If the law couldn't protect me, I'd have to learn how to fight in ways the law didn't understand. I folded the deed neatly and tucked it into a drawer. The rain started again outside, tapping against the window like a warning or maybe a promise. Carter might have stolen my land, but he hadn't seen what I could do when I had nothing left to lose. The lawyer I trusted looked me straight in the eye and told me, "It's not personal, it's business." I walked into Denise Hale's office 3 days later, clutching a folder that felt heavier than stone. Denise was the best affordable attorney I could find in the county, a woman in her early 40s, smart eyes behind thin glasses, the kind who'd seen too many small-town injustices to be surprised by any of them. Her office smelled faintly of old coffee and ink. I sat down across from her, my fingers twisting the edge of my sleeve. "I need help," I said quietly. "My ex-husband tricked me into signing over my father's land." She leaned forward. "Show me." I handed her the papers, the same ones that had haunted me every night since I signed them. She flipped through them carefully, pen tapping against the desk. "Did you read any of this before? Signing?" "Not really," I admitted. "He said it was just confirmation paperwork. He sent someone pretending to be from a real estate firm." She nodded slowly, lips tightening. "So, coercion by deception," she murmured. "It's possible, but hard to prove." "What do you mean, hard to prove?" "He lied to me," I said, my voice rising. She gave me a look that was equal parts sympathy and warning. "Brynn, the law doesn't care about feelings, it cares about evidence. Did he threaten you? Was there any written proof he misrepresented the document?" My throat tightened. "No. Just the phone call. He told me to sign quickly so they could close the records." She sighed, closing the folder. "Without a recording or written deception, it's your word against his. And your signature validates consent. I can file a motion, but the odds aren't in your favor." I sank back into the chair. It felt like being punched in the chest. "So what? He just gets away with stealing everything?" Denise's gaze softened. "He didn't steal it, Brynn. You signed it over." I stared at her, unable to breathe for a moment. That sentence cut deeper than anything Carter had said. "You sound just like him," I whispered. She didn't argue. "I'll file the case," she said finally. "But I need you to prepare yourself. Men like Carter win because they know how to bury people in paperwork." Weeks passed in a blur of legal terms and sleepless nights. Denise filed the motion to contest the transfer on grounds of fraud and manipulation. I testified that I'd been misled and pressured. Carter's response came in neatly typed arrogance. The claimant willingly and knowingly signed all documents. When the hearing date arrived, I wore my father's old watch. It didn't work anymore, but it made me feel like he was there. The courtroom was cold and echoing. Carter sat across from me in a tailored suit, all confidence and charm. He didn't even look nervous. When his lawyer presented the signed deed, it felt like watching a noose tighten. "Mrs. Hartley," the judge said, "did you sign this document of your own free will?" "Yes," I said, voice trembling. But I didn't know what I was signing. He lied to me. "Do you have evidence of that?" "Just my word." The judge adjusted his glasses, his tone neutral but final. "Then legally, this court must uphold the contract as valid." My body went numb. The gavel hit the desk, and just like that, it was over. Carter turned to me as the courtroom emptied, his smile sharp enough to cut. "You never could keep up, Brynn," he said quietly. "You make it too easy." I wanted to hit him, to scream, but all I could do was watch him walk away, victorious again. Denise placed a hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I'll be honest with you, there's nothing more we can do. You could appeal, but it'll cost money you don't have." I laughed bitterly, tears stinging my eyes. "So that's it? He wins because he has a better lawyer and a deeper wallet?" She hesitated. "He wins because he knows the system. It's not fair, but it's how it works." I left the courthouse feeling like a ghost. Outside, the wind bit at my face as if the whole world was reminding me I was alone. I drove to the old property one last time. Half the house was already fenced off. Carter's construction signs were everywhere. The workers avoided my eyes when I stood there, hands trembling, trying to memorize every inch of what used to be home. Ella found me standing in the field that night, dirt on my hands, eyes red. "Mom, can we go home now?" she asked softly. "This is home," I said without thinking. But it wasn't not anymore. That night, Denise called one last time. "I hate saying this, Brynn," she said, "but maybe you should let it go. Start fresh somewhere else. Sometimes peace is worth more than revenge." I hung up without answering. I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the eviction notice still pinned to my fridge. I could hear Carter's words echoing in my mind. "You always did trust too easily." Maybe he was right. But that trust, the part of me that believed in fairness, was gone now, burned out. In its place, something colder was taking root. If justice wouldn't fight for me, I'd learn how to fight for myself. The night we left that house, I didn't just pack our bags, I packed every piece of my pride. We left under the dim yellow of a motel sign that buzzed in the rain like an accusation. The kids carried 2 backpacks and a stuffed rabbit. I carried a cardboard box of photo albums and a sense that everything that mattered had been compressed into the trunk of my car. The motel room smelled of stale perfume and bleach, and the bed springs moaned when I sat down as if the world was complaining with me. For the first week, we were pirates nomads, moving from cheap room to cheaper room, eating takeout between laundry cycles and hiding the truth from the kids as if we were tucking a secret under a bed. I worked doubles at the diner, my hands numb from the cold and the volume of plates, but every tip felt like a small, illicit victory. At night, when the children slept, I would spread the photo albums on the motel table and run my fingers over my father's smile, trying to map the before to the after. Mason asked once, in a voice too small for a 7-year-old, "Mom, where are we going to sleep when Grandpa's house is gone?" I didn't know how to tell him that the house was gone because someone else had decided so with an inked signature, so I said, "We'll make a new home, babe. We'll find a place that likes us back." Homeschooling in a motel felt ridiculous: math problems on a wobbly table, history lessons with fluorescent light buzzing overhead, but I taught them the basics and they taught me how to laugh again. Ella became my little librarian, arranging our lives into neat stacks so we could pretend order existed. Carter's development signs popped up like bruises along the road to town. Hartley Estates coming soon. The irony tasted like bile. One afternoon, while I was working the evening shift, a customer slid a local paper across the counter. The headline was glossy and brazen: "Hartley Development breaks ground." There was a photograph of the property taken. Of course, after the crews had started clearing bulldozers caught mid-devour. The caption called it revitalization. I read it until the words blurred. They were turning my father's workshop into a model home. They'd crushed the shed where he taught me to whittle, the tiny space where he kept his tools and his secrets. My throat closed. That weekend I drove out to the property, which was now a mess of mud and yellow tape. The workshop stood like a wounded animal, half open and littered with fragments of the life we'd had. The swing set, my father's crooked, perfect swing, hung at an angle, seat torn. There were numbers spray-painted on the front steps, markers for destruction. I walked the land like a ghost, my boots sinking into the churned earth, memorizing the slope of the hill, the place where the creek used to shimmer in summer. A neighbor, an old man named Pete who'd known my father since childhood, called out from his porch and offered me a thermos of coffee. He told me he'd seen the men early that morning, measuring and taking notes, eyes down like men afraid of what they'd done. He always liked making things bigger, Pete said quietly. Some folks call it progress, others call it theft. I wanted to tell Pete that it wasn't only the house the land was where my father had buried a time capsule the kids used to dig up every 4th of July, where he'd planted a row of apple trees, where Ella chased fireflies. The loss wasn't measured in square feet. It was measured in sunrises and scraped knees. Nights in the motel made me thinner at the edges. I didn't cry in front of the kids. I had learned that tears had a way of collapsing a room. Instead, I let rage do the heavy lifting, turning it into work. Researching, reading, absorbing every legal article and forum that might help me claw back what I'd lost. I spent hours in the public library, the fluorescent hum a steady companion. I printed out state statutes on property transfer, read through case law about coercion and undue influence, and taught myself the legal jargon that people like Carter used to keep the rest of us small. I met women in the library, women with similar hard lines carved into their faces, and we traded stories like contraband. One woman handed me a photocopied pamphlet about title fraud and a phone number for a low-cost legal clinic 2 counties over. Another slid me an article about developers who used straw purchasers and forged signatures to flip property in months. Each piece of paper felt like a lantern in the dark. I started a folder, physical, dog-eared, full of photocopies, bills, names, and dates. It was messy, but it was mine. At night, I read until my eyes burned, my resolve hardening into something cold and methodical. The kids began to notice. Ella started asking questions about lawyers and how to not be tricked. Mason asked if we were poor now, as if poverty was a shape that could be named and measured. I lied. I told them we were rich in things the bank couldn't count: love, stubbornness, gumption. They believed me because children are architects of hope. The town watched us, as towns do, like a slow-moving weather front, curious, pitying, then distracted. Some neighbors brought casseroles. A few stared when I drove past the property. No one offered to help legally. People have a quiet calculus about trouble. If it smells like more work, they turn their faces. I took to walking the edges of the land at dusk, listening to the distant clank of machinery and letting the memories settle like dust in my chest. The hurt was raw, but it taught me focus. Anger became a tool rather than a fire. I started to map Carter's moves: who financed him, who signed off on permits, which contractors he used. I wrote names in my notebook and crossed them off when I could verify them. Research became a ritual, and rituals give shape to grief. One night, I found a small classified ad tucked in an old paper, seeking experienced paralegal for title research, flexible hours. It felt like a hand reaching through the fog. I clipped it, called the number the next morning, and left a message with my trembling voice. I didn't have a plan yet, I only had a direction. The motel would not be our forever, and the kids deserved more than borrowed nights. I folded the last photo album and tucked it back into the box, feeling the weight of it like ballast. Outside, the rain started again. A slow, steady tapping that sounded less like threat and more like a metronome counting off time for the thing I was about to do. He thought I'd stay broken, but I was learning how to rebuild from the dust he left me in. Sometimes revenge starts not with anger, but with silence. Silence became my armor. I stopped wasting words on anyone who couldn't help me and started collecting information instead. Every minute outside the diner, I spent learning, listening, planning. The legal clinic 2 counties over returned my call. They couldn't reopen my case, but one of their volunteers, a retired investigator named Gloria, offered advice that stuck with me. Men like your ex, she said, her voice raspy with cigarettes and truth. They're predictable. They build their empires on shortcuts. You don't need to fight them head on, just pull one brick from underneath. That sentence became my blueprint. I bought a second-hand laptop, one that barely held charge, and created a new identity, Rebecca Lewis. On paper, Rebecca was everything Brynn wasn't. Confident, detached, successful. She had an email address with a professional domain, a LinkedIn profile filled with fake credentials, and a profile picture I pulled from a stock photo site. Rebecca Lewis was a business consultant specializing in land acquisitions. I told myself it wasn't lying, it was strategy. The first email I sent was to a man named Jonathan Cade, one of Carter's known investors. I'd seen his name in the county's public building permits, listed as a funding partner in Hartley Estates. My message was simple, professional, deliberately vague. Hello, Mr. Cade. I represent a private development group interested in possible acquisitions in your region. I noticed your partnership with Carter Hartley and would like to discuss future opportunities. I hit send, heart pounding. It felt like stepping into a role I'd been rehearsing my entire life. 3 hours later, he replied, Rebecca, I'd be happy to schedule a call. Carter's projects are profitable, though the man himself can be difficult. The corner of my mouth lifted. Difficult was code for careless. Within days, Rebecca had introduced herself to 3 more of Carter's investors and 2 of his contractors. I didn't ask questions directly. I listened, nudged, let them talk. Men like Carter surrounded themselves with people who loved to brag, and bragging always left crumbs. One investor let slip about those zoning waivers that Carter had fast-tracked through a friendly city official. Another complained about delays because Carter was re-signing permits under another entity to hide taxes. I wrote everything down. Dates, names, locations. My little spiral notebook turned into a crime map of arrogance. I met an assistant of Carter's through LinkedIn. Her name was Mara Jennings, fresh out of college, eager to prove herself. She thought Rebecca Lewis worked for a major consulting firm, so she was all smiles when I invited her for coffee. I told her I was scouting potential partnerships with Carter's firm and wanted to understand their internal workflow. She talked for an hour straight. I hardly had to ask questions. She mentioned that Carter often used ghost signers for property transfers. People paid to pose as buyers before flipping parcels to his company for profit. That was it. Proof of the pattern. Maybe not enough to convict him yet, but enough to expose him. After that meeting, I walked out of the cafe and sat in my car until my pulse slowed. I stared at the dashboard, realizing that Rebecca, the fake woman I had created, was fearless in ways Brynn had never been. I needed her more than I wanted to admit. At night, I watched videos about financial fraud, read court cases about developers busted for fake permits, and pieced together Carter's network. I discovered one of his shell companies had been registered using a fake address, an empty storefront in Salem. The signature on the paperwork looked suspiciously familiar. I traced the public filings and nearly laughed when I realized whose name appeared under Notary Public. Jordan Fields. The same man who'd tricked me into signing away my land. I printed everything and pinned it to the motel wall, Carter's name in the center, his associates radiating out like a spider web. In the center, under his photo, I wrote in red ink, "Make him sign what he can't escape." For weeks, I played Rebecca perfectly. I sent polite emails, asked about investments, and complimented Carter's vision. Eventually, his assistant forwarded one of my messages directly to him. 2 days later, an email appeared in my inbox. "Rebecca, Carter Hartley here. Heard you've been asking about my projects. Let's talk numbers." He attached his private cell number. The world tilted for a second. I could almost hear my father's voice whispering, "Don't you dare flinch now, Brynn." I called him the next morning. He answered on the second ring, his tone dripping charm. "Miss Lewis, I hear you're interested in the next big thing." I smiled, even though he couldn't see me. I like to invest in things that last. We talked for 10 minutes. I kept my voice calm, professional, detached. He bragged about the Hartley Estates expansion as if it were the crown jewel of his career. I asked all the right questions: zoning, investor interest, local permits. He answered eagerly, eager to impress what he thought was a potential partner. I recorded every second. When the call ended, I sat in silence, replaying his words. He had just admitted to manipulating land permits and using false zoning classifications to speed up development. It wasn't a smoking gun yet, but it was kindling. Mara texted me a few days later. Carter's nervous. The media's been sniffing around. He's trying to clean up paperwork. He's had Jordan shred a bunch of files. I texted back, pretending concern. That sounds risky. Does he keep digital backups? Always. He's paranoid. Everything's in his office drive. Only he and Jordan have access. That was enough. I didn't need the files yet, I just needed the leverage. I sat in the motel room that night, the laptop glowing blue in the dark, the kids asleep beside me. For the first time since losing the house, I didn't feel powerless. I felt sharp. Dangerous. Alive. The kind of alive that comes when you stop waiting for justice and decide to become it. As dawn began to gray the windows, I closed the laptop and whispered to the quiet room. You wanted signatures, Carter? I'll give you one that'll end you. The same pen that stole my home was about to write his downfall. I didn't have power, but I had his secrets. I remember the exact moment I decided to stop shadowboxing and throw the first real punch. It was past midnight in a motel room that hummed with the refrigerators tired, a breath. The kids slept against me like small, warm anchors, and the laptop screen glowed in the dark like some constellated promise. I had a folder that felt heavier than the rest. Copies of permit applications, snippets of email exchanges I'd coaxed out of an eager assistant, printouts of shell company filings, and the recording from the networking gala where Carter had bragged like a god. I also had one thing I didn't at first realize: I'd need an audience. If the truth stayed in my drawer, it would simply rot there. If it leaked into the light, it might start a chain reaction. I thought of Megan Reyes, the local reporter I'd met once when I worked a late shift and she'd come in for coffee. She was sharp, impatient with polite lies, and had a nose for stories that made people squirm. I drafted an email that felt like walking a tightrope, not accusatory enough to sound like a vendetta, not timid enough to be ignored. I attached a single innocuous document: anomalies in zoning permits, and wrote, I think you should look at this. There's more if you want it. I hit send and then sat very still, like someone waiting for a match to catch. Megan replied within an hour. Can we talk? This looks weird. We met in a coffee shop that smelled of burnt espresso and ambition. I watched her listen, watched the way her pen paused when I handed over the recording of Carter bragging about making signatures work in my favor. She didn't flinch at the name. She had a habit of looking at people like they were puzzles. If you fit the wrong piece in, she'd find the missing one. Over the next week, she dug in. She filed public records requests, called anonymous sources, and quietly corroborated what I'd sent her. I didn't tell her who I was. I let Rebecca be the shy whistleblower in her inbox. When her first story ran, it was careful, headline light. The kind of piece that insinuates rather than indicts. Questions raised over Hartley development, permits. It was enough. Enough to set a bee buzzing in every investor's ear. Investors are like sharks for rumors. One sniff of blood sent them circling. Phones started ringing in Carter's office, terse, frantic conversations about audits and contingency plans. He looked like a man realizing he might have miscalculated the weather. I watched it all unfold from a distance, more spectator than participant, and felt a dangerous kind of satisfaction. The important thing wasn't just that the story ran, it was the ripple it caused. Contractors delayed deliveries, banks asked for more documentation, and the county planning office announced an internal review. Carter wasn't invincible anymore. He was vulnerable, and vulnerability rusts even the sharpest blades. He panicked in ways that made him sloppy. He demanded his assistant Mara clean up digital folders, and I saw him send Jordan Fields to manage some documents. Jordan, who'd notarized my signature and smiled while he did it. It was almost theatrical in its predictability. One afternoon, Mara stormed out of the office under a storm of accusations. She was fragile and furious, clutching a thumb drive she swore contained backups. Carter insisted he didn't need anyone to access. She called a number I'd given her for Rebecca and left a voice message that was part confession, part plea. He keeps everything in this drive. He thinks only he can touch it. There are offshore transfers. I saw them. I replayed that message in the motel room until it felt like a mantra. Offshore transfers, tax fraud. Money moved through phantom companies. Those words were a different weight than zoning shenanigans. That was criminal. That was federal. With that single piece of proof, Carter's little paper empire could turn into a house of cards. I handed the drive and the recording to Megan with hands that didn't shake. She held the evidence like a doctor would hold a specimen, careful, clinical, determined. Within 48 hours, her headline changed from tentative to explosive. Local developer under federal scrutiny. Offshore accounts exposed. Investors pulled out money faster than I could refresh the page. Stock-like confidence in Carter's projects deflated. Contractors grew jittery. Vendors demanded assurances. Carter hired a lawyer who moved like a shark in a tuxedo, slick, expensive, and aggressive. He sent cease and desist letters, called Megan to threaten libel suits, and demanded Megan hand over her source. She refused. He subpoenaed servers, subpoenaed telephones. The town that had quietly gossiped now gaped openly. For the first time in months, people looked at me differently, some faces full of schadenfreude, others full of fear for what a scandal might mean for our fragile local economy. The kids noticed the change in me before I did. Ella watched me at the motel sink washing dishes, and without accusing, she said, "You're different, Mom. You don't look tired in the same way." Mason asked if Carter was going to jail now. I lied to them both with a smile I practiced in the mirror. The adrenaline that had kept me awake through long nights started cutting through the fog of helplessness and fueling something steadier: strategy. I wasn't just trying to ruin Carter, I was trying to erase the mechanism that allowed him to take us. I had to be precise. I had to be smarter than his lawyers, quicker than his damage control, and cleaner than his denials. I kept my alias airtight. I used burner emails, routed messages through VPNs, and met sources in crowded places where a face blends into the noise. I learned to love the hush of secrecy. Weeks into the unraveling, Carter made one of the classic mistakes of men with too much to lose. He underestimated the quiet woman he'd hurried past. He doubled down on threats, believing fear would shut mouths. Instead, it opened them. One of his investors, afraid of being dragged into federal investigations, turned on him and gave Megan the documents she needed to map the offshore trail straight to his shell companies. The DA's office called for an investigation, and the air around Carter grew thin and hot like the last breath of a candle. I sat in my car across from the diner the day agents quietly showed up at his office. I watched the paramilitary-like precision of men in suits and jackets taking files, tagging boxes, loading them into an unmarked van. Carter stood in the doorway like a small, exposed animal. For a moment, his eyes found mine across the street. He didn't recognize me. He saw a stranger and the cocky glare he'd worn for years. He didn't know who had cut the rope. Carter still didn't know it was me, but soon, the mask would come off. Revenge feels different when you're staring into the eyes of the man who destroyed you. When Carter's empire began to crumble, the invitations started pouring in. Not to me. Of course, to Rebecca Lewis. The mysterious consultant investors were suddenly desperate to impress. I saw my opportunity hiding in plain sight. A charity networking gala for local development innovators was being held at the downtown Civic Center, a glittering, self-congratulatory circus where people like Carter thrived. I RSVP'd as Rebecca, printed a fake badge, borrowed a dress from a thrift store that still smelled faintly of someone else's perfume, and practiced my new smile in the mirror. The kind that said, "I'm not afraid of you anymore." The night of the gala, the air was thick with money and perfume. The chandeliers threw fractured light across polished glass tables. And every conversation was sugar-coated arrogance. I walked in with quiet confidence, my heels steady despite the storm in my chest. I scanned the crowd until I saw him, Carter. He was laughing too loudly, gesturing too broadly, performing charm like it was his last currency. The same man who once convinced me to sign away my life now looked like he was auditioning to keep his. I approached the bar, ordered sparkling water, and waited. He turned just as I intended him to. His eyes caught mine, and I watched the faint flicker of calculation. Was I new, important, useful? That hunger was his weakness. "Rebecca Lewis," I said, extending my hand with a practiced grin. "I've heard so much about your work, Mr. Hartley." "Please," he said, puffing his chest slightly. "Call me Carter." Of course he wanted to be called Carter. It made him feel human. We talked for 15 minutes, maybe 20. He thought he was impressing me. I was recording every word through the mic clipped under my necklace. He bragged about media smears, about how his competitors had fabricated stories to sabotage his reputation. I tilted my head and smiled. "You must have been very persuasive to recover so many properties so quickly. How do you do it?" I asked, my tone perfectly curious, perfectly naive. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Half of these bureaucrats don't even read what they stamp. You just give them what looks right, and they sign. Most people are lazy, they trust the paperwork. That's how I built this empire." I nodded, pretending admiration while my heart thundered. He didn't stop there. He mentioned almost proudly that he cleaned up documents with help from his buddy Jordan, and that no one would ever trace the notaries if the signatures lined up. I had to force myself not to look away. Every word was a nail in his own coffin, and he was hammering them joyfully. When he placed his hand on my arm, smiling that same smirk that once made me question my own sanity, I didn't flinch. I looked right at him. Calm, unreadable. "You know, Mr. Hartley," I said quietly, "people like you always forget one thing." He raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "They forget that signatures work both ways." He laughed, dismissing the comment, but something in my tone must have registered, because his smile faltered for half a second. I excused myself soon after, leaving him basking in the glow of his own arrogance. I slipped out to the parking lot, heart pounding, every nerve in my body electric. I sat in my car and listened to the recording. Every word was crisp, clear, damning. Back at the motel, I transferred the audio to multiple encrypted drives. My reflection in the laptop screen didn't look like Brynn anymore. Rebecca was fading too. What stared back was someone forged between them, someone who knew exactly what she was capable of. The next morning, Carter called Rebecca. His voice was unsteady now, the charm frayed. "You disappeared early last night," he said. "Did I say something wrong?" I smiled into the phone. "No, you said everything right." He laughed awkwardly, unsure whether I was flirting or threatening. "Maybe we should meet again, talk business." "Absolutely," I replied. "But next time let's make sure the paperwork is clean." The line went silent for a beat. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. Then he chuckled, forced and tight. "You're clever. I like that." When I hung up, I knew he was starting to feel it, the smallest tremor of fear. That was enough. Fear makes people sloppy. And Carter's version of sloppy was deadly to him. Within days, I received an email from Megan, the journalist. She'd gotten a tip that Carter was scrambling to correct past documents and reach out to former notaries to align dates. In other words, he was tampering with evidence while under investigation. I sent her the recording anonymously. No signature, no name, just an audio file titled "Hartley Admits." She didn't need to know it was me. The truth spoke loud enough on its own. That night, as the kids slept and the hum of the highway filtered through the motel curtains, I replayed Carter's words again and again. I thought of my father's voice, of his hands guiding mine when he taught me to sand down wood, saying, "If you smooth it too fast, you'll miss the grain. Always pay attention to the grain, Brynn." I finally understood what he meant. Revenge had a grain too, and I had followed it perfectly. 2 mornings later, a new headline appeared online. Exclusive audio leaked. Developer admits to manipulating county records. The story went viral faster than any of Megan's previous pieces. The The recording played on local radio, on social media, in the background of breakfast diners where everyone had an opinion but no one knew the truth. Carter's phone must have been melting with calls, because I received 1-2 blocked number. Shaky breath. No charm left. Brynn, he said. Not Rebecca. Brynn, we need to talk. My blood went cold at the sound of my real name. He'd figured it out. I didn't answer. I just listened to his breath quicken, his tone teetering between anger and fear. I know it's you, he hissed. You think this'll save you? You think people will believe a bitter ex-wife over me? I stayed silent. Then, before he hung up, I whispered just one line. You should have read my eyes before you read my name. The silence that followed was thick, furious, final. I hung up, stared at the dark screen, and let out a laugh that sounded nothing like joy. It was release the kind that comes after months of carrying the weight of justice no one else would deliver. The next day, federal investigators raided his office again. This time, they didn't walk out with files. They walked out with Carter. That recording would become his death sentence. Sometimes justice arrives wearing the face of revenge. The morning after Carter's arrest, the world felt unnaturally quiet. Not peaceful, just holding its breath. The news broke before breakfast. Local developer detained on fraud and coercion allegations. His mugshot flashed across every local channel, and for the first time in years, his smile wasn't rehearsed. It was gone. I sat on the motel bed, the TV's flicker painting the room in flashes of blue and gray, my coffee turning cold in my hand. Ella shuffled out of bed, rubbing her eyes. Mom, she said, that's him, isn't it? I nodded slowly. Yeah, baby, that's him. Mason crawled up beside me, his hair wild, eyes glued to the screen. Did you do that? He asked in that blunt, innocent way only a child can. I hesitated, then whispered, I helped the truth find him. It wasn't pride that filled me, it was relief, raw and trembling. For months I'd been holding a boulder of anger on my chest, and now, finally, it was rolling downhill. But peace never comes clean. Within hours, the story spread beyond our small town. National media picked it up, calling Carter a regional magnate accused of fraud. The words sounded fancy for what he really was. A thief who'd finally been cornered. The phone didn't stop ringing. Megan called first. Whoever sent that audio file, she said, her voice shaking with adrenaline. Blew this case wide open. They've opened a federal probe. You don't happen to know who my source is, do you? I smiled faintly. Just someone who was tired of watching him win. She laughed. Whoever she is, she's a damn hero. I hung up, staring at the ceiling. Unsure if hero was the right word. Heroes sleep at night. I hadn't slept soundly in months. By noon, every station in Oregon had a segment about the scandal. Investors were pulling out faster than rain through open hands. Properties were frozen, accounts flagged, contracts voided. Every piece of Carter's empire that he'd built with greed and deceit was collapsing like a wet house of cards. For once, I didn't feel powerless watching it burn. The lawyer went on TV, wearing an expression that belonged on a preacher selling forgiveness. My client has been the victim of a calculated defamation campaign, he said smoothly. We will prove his innocence and expose those responsible for this malicious attack. Those responsible. I knew he meant me. That night, there was a knock at my motel door. When I opened it, Denise stood there, the lawyer who once told me to let go. Her eyes were tired, but there was something sharper there now. I saw the news, she said, stepping inside. You wouldn't happen to know anything about the source of those leaks, would you? I met her gaze without blinking. Why? Are you here to warn me or congratulate me? She sighed. Both, maybe. The DA's office is reopening your property case. They found new evidence recordings, fraudulent notary stamps, even fake zoning forms. They think Carter used the same playbook on multiple victims, but they'll want to talk to whoever had access to those files. I just read the news like everyone else, I said, my tone steady but my heart racing. Denise studied me for a long moment, then smiled faintly. You always were smarter than people gave you credit for. She handed me her card. If anyone contacts you, call me first. And Brynn, be careful. You may have won, but men like him don't go quietly. After she left, I sat at the table, staring at the thin motel curtain shifting with the wind. Somewhere across town, Carter was probably pacing a holding cell, plotting his next move. The thought didn't scare me as much as it should have. 2 days later, Megan published another story, this time with names. Not just Carter's, but the county officials who'd looked the other way, the notaries who'd falsified documents, and the banks that had ignored red flags. The investigation had turned into a wildfire, and everyone who'd fed off Carter's success was scrambling for cover. I couldn't help but smile. For once, the system that failed me was working against him. Still, not everyone saw it that way. My phone began buzzing with blocked calls. Voicemails filled with static and whispers, people warning me to watch my back, others accusing me of ruining jobs and tearing the town apart. Someone slipped a note under my motel door that said, "We know what you did." It wasn't signed, but the shaky handwriting told me it wasn't Carter. It was fear from the people who'd benefited from his lies. Ella noticed the tension. "Mom," she said one evening, "when do we go home?" Her question cracked something in me. Home. The word felt like a foreign language now. "Soon," I said, even though I didn't know what that meant anymore. Maybe home wasn't a place. Maybe it was the moment you stopped running from your own story. The following morning, the news showed footage of Carter leaving the courthouse in handcuffs. His once perfect suit was wrinkled, his hair uncombed. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and for the first time I saw it, fear in his eyes. Real, unfiltered fear. I whispered to the TV. "Now you know what it feels like." But satisfaction isn't as sweet as I imagined. Watching him fall didn't fix the cracks he left in me. It didn't erase the nights I'd spent crying quietly beside my kids, or the ache of losing my father's land. Justice doesn't always heal, it just stops the bleeding. That night, I took the kids for ice cream, something we hadn't done in months. They laughed, sticky-faced and free, while I watched the neon sign above us blink open and realized how long it had been since I felt like something in my life still was. I looked at them and thought, maybe this is the start of peace. When I put them to bed later, I sat by the window, watching headlights streak across the highway, each one a reminder that the world keeps moving, no matter who falls. I didn't know what would come. Next, the trial, the questions, the headlines, but I knew this much: I wasn't afraid anymore. Carter's empire was cracking, but I hadn't yet decided how far I'd let it fall. Just when I thought I'd won, my own lies started knocking. I should have known peace wouldn't last. It never does, not when it's built on secrets. For a few fleeting weeks, life seemed to stretch into something almost normal. The motel felt less like exile and more like a layover on the way back to living. The kids were laughing again. I started sleeping for more than 2 hours at a time. But deep down, I could feel the storm gathering again, low, heavy, inevitable. It arrived one Tuesday morning in the form of a knock on the door. Sharp. Official. 2 people stood outside, a man and a woman in crisp suits, badges glinting against the gray light. "Mrs. Hartley?" the woman asked. "Yes?" "We're with the FBI. Financial Crimes Division. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your ex-husband, Carter Hartley." My blood ran cold. I forced a polite smile. "Of course. Come in." They stepped inside, their presence making the small room shrink by half. The man looked around, noting every detail, as if the peeling wallpaper could betray me. "Were you aware," the woman began, "that several documents and communications connected to Mr. Hartley's financial accounts were leaked from a private email associated with this motel's Wi-Fi?" Every muscle in my body froze. My heartbeat thundered so loud I could barely hear her next words. "We're not accusing you of anything at this point," she continued. "But if you have information about the source of those leaks, it would help your case and ours." I swallowed hard. "I don't know anything about that. I've just been trying to move on." The woman tilted her head, studying me. You're sure? Because the alias used Rebecca Lewis's was tied to several inquiries about Mr. Hartley's companies. Curious coincidence, don't you think? It was like hearing my own name shouted through a megaphone. Rebecca Lewis. The ghost I had created was haunting me now. I forced a steady breath. I've heard about her. I lied. Whoever she is, she's doing what nobody else could. The man smirked faintly. That's one way to look at it. He handed me a card. If you remember anything, call us. Soon. When they left, I collapsed against the door. My hands trembled so violently that I dropped the card onto the floor. They knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to circle me. I had to be careful now. 2 days later, Megan called. Her voice was tense, not excited like before. Brynn. Something's happening. Carter's lawyer filed a motion claiming the evidence against him was fabricated. He's saying you framed him. My throat went dry. That's ridiculous. I know, she said quickly. But they're pushing hard. They're painting you as a bitter ex-wife with a vendetta. If they can convince the judge that the leaks came from you, it could compromise the entire case. My knees went weak. Megan, you can't. Don't worry. She cut in. I'm not naming sources. But you need to lay low. Don't talk to anyone you don't trust. Lay low. I'd been hiding for months. I didn't know how to disappear any deeper. That night, the motel felt smaller than ever. I could hear the rain tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. I sat on the bed, staring at the wall where I'd once pinned Carter's web of lies. Now it was empty, the papers long since destroyed, but the ghost of that map still lingered in my mind. Ella came out of the bathroom, towel wrapped around her hair. Mom, is he going to hurt us again? She asked. I pulled her close. No, honey. He's already lost. But as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow. The next morning, I found a headline online. Whistleblower identity under investigation. My stomach dropped as I read the speculative paragraphs, anonymous sources, legal jargon, the word ex-wife thrown around like bait. My name wasn't printed, but it didn't need to be. Everyone in town could connect the dots. By noon, I started receiving calls from blocked numbers again. Some were supportive, but others were venom disguised as curiosity. How does it feel to ruin a man's career? One voice sneered before hanging up. At the diner, people stared longer than usual. One woman whispered, not quite softly enough. That's her. The one who set him up. The words slid under my skin like splinters. When I got back to the motel that evening, there was a note slipped under the door. This one was shorter than the last. We're watching. My hands shook as I crumpled it. Mason asked what it was. Nothing, I said too quickly. But he was old enough to recognize fear when he saw it. The pressure built fast. I was terrified of the FBI showing up again. Terrified that Megan might be forced to reveal me. Terrified of what Carter's people might do if they found out for sure. But beneath all that fear was something steadier, sharper resolve. I hadn't gone this far to let him twist the truth into another weapon. That night, I called Denise. He's trying to turn it on me, I said. He's saying I fabricated evidence. She didn't sound surprised. He's desperate. He's cornered. Desperate men will set fires just to see who burns first. So what do? Don't react. Document everything. If they come for you, we'll turn it. Turn it how? By giving them something bigger. Those words stuck in my head long after the call ended. Something bigger. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I knew I was done hiding. I spent the next few days gathering everything: emails, notes, recordings, every scrap of proof I'd kept buried. I wasn't going to run anymore. I was going to confront the flames myself. On the 7th night, I sat alone in the dark, staring at my reflection in the window. My face looked older, harder. But my eyes, they were steady now. I wasn't scared of what was coming. I picked up the phone, opened the recorder app, and whispered into the silence. If they want the truth, I'll give it to them. If they wanted the truth, I'd give them all of it, every brutal, burning piece. It began with one signature, so it had to end with one. By the time the sun rose the next morning, I'd already made my choice. I was done running from the storm. I'd lived through worse, the kind of worse that leaves you stripped of pride and paperless in a motel room with 2 kids and a prayer. If Carter wanted to twist the story, I would give him the unedited version. The truth, signed, sealed, and loud enough that no lawyer could drown it out. I sat at the small table in the corner of the room, the one that wobbled whenever Mason leaned on it, and spread out every document I'd kept hidden. The motel's weak light flickered overhead, buzzing like a nervous witness. On one side, I had Carter's fraudulent zoning permits and offshore account transfers. On the other, the audio transcripts, the emails under my alias, and the notarized documents that bore Jordan's false stamp. The puzzle was complete. And it spelled one thing: intent. I opened a blank page on my laptop and began to type my confession, not of guilt, but of truth. Line by line, I told the story from the beginning. How Carter had deceived me, how he had used Jordan to steal my father's land, and how I had created Rebecca Lewis to uncover his crimes. I didn't hide behind excuses or soft words. I told it like it was: messy, painful, necessary. By the time I reached the end, the document was 10 pages long. I printed 3 copies, signed each one, and dated them. My signature didn't shake. For the first time since that awful day in my kitchen, I was signing something that belonged to me. I placed one copy in a yellow envelope addressed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division. The second went to the District Attorney's Office. The third I sealed for Megan, the journalist who had turned whispers into thunder. Then, with trembling fingers, I slid each envelope into a blue mailbox downtown. The metallic clink of the lid echoed like a gunshot. It was done. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a fugitive from my own decisions. I felt clean. Exposed, yes, but clean. 2 days later, they came for Carter again. Not in the quiet hush of a preliminary raid this time, but in full view of the cameras. I watched it unfold on TV, my heart steady as they escorted him in handcuffs through a sea of flashing lights. The reporters shouted his name. He didn't look up. His jaw was tight, his arrogance deflated. For once, he looked human. Megan called me that night. Her voice was quiet, reverent almost. "You did it, didn't you?" I didn't answer. She didn't press. "They have everything now, the recordings, the offshore files, the notarized forgeries. They're reopening your property case too. It's over, Brynn." I let the silence stretch between us. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "It's not over. Not until the truth is written down where he can't erase it." The next morning, the mailman knocked on my motel door with a registered letter. It was from the county court. My motion to reopen the property deed had been approved pending review. I sat down on the bed, the letter trembling in my hand, tears stinging my eyes. Ella and Mason ran over, both curious. "Is it good news, Mom?" Ella asked. I nodded slowly, unable to speak. "It's a start." Over the next week, things moved fast. The DA called me in for an interview, not as a suspect this time, but as a whistleblower. Denise came with me, her calm voice and measured tone guiding me through every question. "Miss Hartley," the investigator said, "you understand that admitting to the alias Rebecca Lewis's means acknowledging that you accessed confidential information." "Yes," I said, meeting his gaze. "But I also understand that if I hadn't, you wouldn't have known the full extent of Carter's crimes." He looked down at my statement, nodded once, and said quietly, "Sometimes justice needs a little push." I signed the official affidavit in front of him. Each stroke of my pen felt like closing a wound that had been bleeding for too long. Denise squeezed my shoulder when it was done. "That's it," she said softly. "You've done your part, now let the system do the rest." The following morning, Carter was formally charged with fraud, coercion, forgery, and tax evasion. The list of counts stretched longer than my arm. The courthouse steps overflowed with reporters and spectators as the DA gave a brief statement. "Thanks to new evidence provided by an anonymous whistleblower, we've uncovered a pattern of financial manipulation that spans years." Anonymous. I smiled at that word. My name didn't need to be there. The truth was loud enough without it. That night, as the kids slept, I sat by the motel window watching the city lights flicker like fireflies. My reflection in the glass looked tired but peaceful. I thought about my father and how proud he would have been to see his daughter finally stand tall. I reached into the drawer, pulled out the first document I'd ever signed for Carter, and stared at my younger self's careless signature, the one that had started it all. I tore it in half, then into quarters, until it was nothing but confetti of regret scattered on the floor. The pen that once ruined me lay beside the torn pieces. I picked it up, rolled it between my fingers, then used it to sign one last thing, a new affidavit reclaiming ownership of my father's land. It was poetic, almost painfully so. The same hand that had given everything away was now reclaiming it. As the ink dried, I whispered to the empty room. It began with one signature. It ends with this one. For the first time in forever, I didn't feel trapped. I felt free unapologetically, irrevocably free. For the first time, I was signing something that truly belonged to me, my freedom. Carter looked smaller than I remembered. The courthouse smelled like cold marble and old dust, like a place that had seen too many people begging for things they'd already lost. I stood in the hallway that morning, palms sweating despite the air conditioning, the echo of footsteps bouncing off the walls like ghosts of old verdicts. Denise was beside me, her calm presence grounding me in a world that still didn't feel real. "It's just testimony," she said quietly. "Tell the truth, stay composed, and remember you've already won more than you think." I nodded, clutching my folder. Inside were copies of everything: the permits, the financial trails, the recording transcripts, evidence that had cost me nearly everything to find. My kids were with my mother that day, far from the courthouse, because I didn't want them to see what revenge looked like when it finally reached daylight. When they brought Carter in, the room fell into that strange silence that only power losing its disguise can create. He wasn't in a tailored suit this time. The expensive watch was gone. His hair was disheveled, his once sure posture replaced by something almost hunched. For the first time, he didn't look like a man who thought he could buy his way out of anything. Our eyes met for the briefest moment. The smirk I had memorized was gone. What I saw instead was disbelief, like he was still trying to rewrite reality in his head. The judge entered, the clerk called the session to order, and the first day of his trial began. I sat through hours of testimony: contractors, accountants, former investors, all unspooling the threads of Carter's web. Each one told a story that mirrored mine in smaller ways: the manipulation, the lies, the charm he used like a scalpel. It wasn't just me he had exploited. He had built an empire on the backs of trust and shortcuts. When my name was called, my legs felt heavy. But I walked forward with my head high. I took the oath, placed my hand on the Bible, and sat down at the witness stand. "Mrs. Hartley," the prosecutor began, "can you describe, in your own words, how your signature was obtained on the property transfer document?" I took a breath. Steady and even. "Carter sent someone pretending to be a representative from a real estate firm. He told me the paperwork was just a formality to secure my father's land. He said to sign quickly so there wouldn't be delays. I trusted him. I didn't know I was signing away everything." The courtroom was quiet except for the scratching of pens and the steady hum of the ceiling fans. The prosecutor nodded. "And what made you decide to investigate further?" I glanced at Carter. His eyes darted down. "Because I realized that if I didn't, no one else would. The law had already turned its back on me once. I wasn't going to let it happen again." His attorney stood, his voice slick as oil. "Mrs. Hartley, is it true that you created a false identity and used it to obtain confidential information about my client's business dealings?" I met his gaze without flinching. "It's true. I became the only kind of person he respected: a predator. And in doing so, I found the truth you're now trying to bury." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge banged the gavel once, calling for order. The lawyer smirked. "So, by your own admission, you broke the law." "I told the truth," I said quietly. "Something your client hasn't done in years." Denise smiled faintly beside me. The prosecutor resumed, steering the questions back to the evidence, and piece by piece, the puzzle formed before everyone's eyes. The offshore accounts, the the false notary stamps, the manipulated zoning files, it was all laid bare, undeniable. By the end of the week, Carter's team was in shambles. His closest associates flipped on him, testifying that he had ordered them to forge documents and move money. One of them even admitted that Carter bragged about tricking his ex-wife to investors, calling it poetic justice. When the judge finally read the verdict, I barely breathed. The words came like slow rain. Guilty on all counts: fraud, coercion, forgery, and tax evasion. The courtroom erupted, some gasps, some applause quickly silenced by the gavel. I didn't clap. I just sat there, staring at the man who had stolen years of my life, and watched as two marshals cuffed him. Carter looked back at me one last time, and I'll never forget the look on his face. It wasn't anger, it was recognition. The realization that the woman he'd underestimated had become the very thing that ended him. The judge spoke again, her tone steady. Furthermore, this court restores the rightful ownership of the Hartley property to Mrs. Brynn Hartley. Effective immediately. For a moment, I couldn't process the words. Denise squeezed my arm, whispering, "That's it! You got it back!" It felt surreal. Like waking from a nightmare you've been stuck in so long you'd forgotten what daylight looked like. I stood, tears burning at the corners of my eyes, and nodded silently at the judge. I didn't want to cry, not there, not in front of him. Outside the courthouse, the air was sharp and bright, the kind of cold that stings but reminds you you're alive. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones like arrows, questions flying faster than I could process. How does it feel to win? Do you have any regrets? What's next for you? I didn't answer all of them. I just walked down the steps, each one lighter than the last, until I reached the bottom where Ella and Mason were waiting with my mother. The kids ran into my arms, their laughter cutting through the chaos like sunlight through fog. I looked up at the courthouse, a towering monument to both failure and redemption, and whispered, "Justice signs slower, but it signs stronger." Denise joined us a moment later, smiling for the first time in weeks. "You did it, Brynn. It's over." I shook my head. "No," I said softly, holding my children close. "It's just beginning, because victory doesn't erase scars, it just reminds you where they were." But victory doesn't erase scars, it only reminds you where they were. I didn't recognize the land when I walked back onto it. It felt haunted, but free. The day I stepped back onto my father's property, the air was thick with silence. Not the kind that suffocates, but the kind that waits like the earth itself was holding its breath, watching me return. The grass was knee-high, wildflowers tangled in the remains of construction debris. The old fence leaned like it had grown tired of standing alone. But it was mine again, every inch of it. Ella ran ahead, laughing, spinning in the open field where the swing set used to be. Mason followed, holding a stick like a sword, slashing at the tall grass. I just stood there, my shoes sinking into the damp ground, feeling every beat of my heart echo through the soil. I'd spent so many nights dreaming of this moment that I wasn't sure how to exist inside it. The house, what was left of it, was barely standing. Carter's crews had gutted most of the foundation before the court order froze construction. Half the siding was gone, the windows shattered, the porch collapsing under its own weight. It wasn't the home I grew up in. It was a scar on the landscape, but scars mean survival. Denise met me there later that afternoon with a man from the restoration company. "It'll take time," she warned. "And money." I smiled faintly. "Everything worth keeping does." Over the next few weeks, I worked harder than I ever had in my life. Every morning before sunrise, I was there, hauling wood, sweeping dust, scraping paint, and piecing together memories that had been torn apart. Friends from town started showing up, too, people who'd watched my story unfold on the news. Some brought tools, others brought food, a few just brought company. I didn't turn anyone away. By the end of the first month, we had cleared the land, stabilized the structure, and started planning something new. I didn't want to rebuild my old life. That chapter was over. I wanted to create something that mattered not just for me, but for others who'd been broken and didn't know how to start again. That's how Hartley Haven was born. It started as an idea on a scrap of paper, half doodle, half dream. A community center for single mothers, women who'd lost everything to manipulation, to deceit, to men who thought paperwork could erase people. A place for rebuilding lives, not just walls. When I told Denise about it, she didn't hesitate. "We'll make it legal," she said. Drafting documents faster than I could describe my vision. Megan helped too, using her platform to share my story. Donations started coming in, first a trickle, then a steady stream. Local carpenters offered to work for free. A college art professor volunteered his students to paint murals. Even Pete, my father's old neighbor, showed up one morning with his pickup truck full of lumber and said, "Your dad would have done the same for me." The first room we finished was the kitchen. I insisted on that. It was the heart of any home, my father used to say. We painted the walls pale yellow, the color of sunrise, and filled it with mismatched furniture that somehow fit perfectly together. Every dent, every scratch told a story. The grand opening came 6 months later. The sign out front, hand-painted by Ella, read, "Welcome to Hartley Haven, a place to begin again." Dozens of people came, some I knew, most I didn't. Women holding toddlers, teenagers volunteering, old men offering donations. I gave a short speech, but my voice cracked halfway through. "This land was taken from me once," I said, looking out at the faces around me. "But it taught me something, that when someone steals your home, they don't take your heart with it. You can build again, you just have to start." The applause that followed felt like healing. Not for them, for me. After everyone left, I stood alone inside the building, tracing my fingers along the frame of the doorway. The smell of fresh paint and sawdust filled the air, mixing with the scent of wildflowers from outside. I hung one last item on the wall, a framed copy of the court order that restored my ownership. It wasn't there as a trophy, it was a reminder. Ella found me staring at it. "Grandpa would like this," she said softly. I smiled. "He would, he always believed in second chances." She pointed to a patch of soil near the window. "Can we plant a tree here?" We did, an apple tree, just like the ones my father used to grow. Mason dug the hole while Ella watered the roots. When we were done, I whispered a thank you to the earth. As the sun set, the building glowed golden through the windows. It wasn't finished, not even close, but it was alive. It breathed with hope. That night, I sat outside with a notebook in my lap, sketching plans for the next phase: housing for women escaping abusive relationships, legal workshops for those facing coercion, financial literacy classes. Each line I drew felt like reclaiming something more than land. It was reclaiming faith in myself. Megan visited again a few weeks later to do a follow-up story. From Victim to Visionary. Her headline read. It made me laugh, mostly because it sounded too big for who I really was. I wasn't a visionary, I was just a woman who got tired of being quiet. As she packed up her camera, she asked, "What's next for you?" I looked around at the half-finished garden, the laughter of kids echoing through the halls, the women chatting inside about job applications and school enrollment. "What's next?" I repeated, smiling. "Life, the kind I build myself this time." When she left, I locked up and walked to the field where the old swing used to hang. The grass brushed against my legs, cool and forgiving. I tilted my head toward the stars and thought of my father. I could almost hear his voice. "Ink can destroy, but it can also create." I took a deep breath, the kind that fills every corner of your lungs, and whispered, "I created something good, Dad." The night air carried my words away, but I knew he heard them. He used to say ink can destroy, but it can also create. I thought revenge would taste sweet, it tasted like quiet peace instead. Months passed, and the rhythm of life settled into something almost ordinary again. For the first time in years, I woke up without dread sitting on my chest. The mornings at Hartley Haven started early, coffee brewing before dawn, the smell of fresh bread from the kitchen drifting through open windows. The building, once a skeleton of pain, was now alive with laughter, chatter, and the sound of children's feet racing down the halls. I still carried the weight of everything that had happened, but it wasn't crushing me anymore. It was shaping me. Carter's sentencing came 3 months after the verdict. I didn't go to the hearing. Denise called that morning and said, 15 years. No parole for at least 10. I was silent for a moment, staring at the papers on my desk. Good, I said softly. But the word didn't feel victorious, it felt heavy. He wasn't just a villain in my story. He was part of the years I'd wasted trying to believe love could change a man. Now he'd be sitting in a concrete box, and I would be out here learning to live. The town moved on faster than I expected. New scandals came, new faces filled the news. People started talking about Hartley Haven instead of the trial. Local businesses donated supplies. A church group offered free meals every Thursday. The center became something bigger than me, it became a sanctuary. We had mothers who came with nothing but a backpack and hope, women who sat in the same place I once had, shaking, lost, and hungry for safety. I knew exactly how to help them, not because I'd studied it, but because I'd lived it. One evening, after a long day of organizing donation drives, Denise stopped by with a bottle of wine and 2 plastic cups. We sat on the porch as the sun went down, watching kids chase each other through the field. You know, she said, you could press charges against Jordan too. He notarized those fake documents. I shook my head. No. He's not worth another minute of my life. I'm done chasing ghosts. She smiled faintly. You sound like someone who's finally free. Maybe I am, I said, watching Ella and Mason build a small fort out of cardboard boxes. Maybe I'm finally learning that peace isn't found in payback, it's in letting go. Megan's article about the center came out the next week. The headline read, From Signature to Sanctuary. One woman's fight to rebuild hope. I cried when I read it, not because it was flattering, but because it was true. For once, my story wasn't about loss. It was about resilience. At night, when the center was quiet and the kids were asleep, I'd walk the halls alone, turning off the lights room by room. Each darkened space whispered pieces of the past, the motel room, the courtroom, the nights of fear, and reminded me how far I'd come. I'd stop by the framed court order hanging on the wall and touch the edge of the glass. It wasn't just a document. It was proof that I'd survived my own destruction. I still got letters from people who'd seen the news. Some were thank yous, women telling me that my story gave them courage to leave someone toxic or stand up to someone powerful. Others were from people who didn't understand, who said I should have forgiven sooner. I didn't reply to any of them. Forgiveness wasn't a letter you mailed out, it was something you learned to live inside of. One afternoon, Denise brought me a new batch of legal forms for the center leases, partnership contracts, grant applications. I laughed as I flipped through them. You know, after everything, I still hate signing things. She chuckled. Maybe that's healthy. Still, I signed them all carefully, deliberately, eyes tracing every line. My signature wasn't a weakness anymore. It was a weapon I knew how to wield. A few weeks later, I was teaching a workshop at the center about legal literacy. A room full of women sat before me, pens poised, notebooks open. Here's what I want you to remember, I told them. You're not powerless just because someone tells you you are. Paperwork is power. Learn it, understand it, and never sign something you don't own. When I looked up, I saw nods, tears, and determination shining back at me. That moment was worth every sleepless night I'd ever had. Still, some nights I woke up from dreams of the past, Carter's voice echoing through the dark, the sound of a pen scratching across paper. But when I opened my eyes, I'd see my children sleeping safely down the hall, the faint glow of the Hartley Haven sign outside, and I'd remember, he couldn't touch me anymore. Ella grew taller, more confident, already talking about law school. I want to help people like you, Mom, she said one morning while packing her school bag. People who get tricked into losing what's theirs. I smiled and kissed her forehead. Then, you'll be unstoppable. Mason wanted to be a builder, like Grandpa, he said. I let him hammer pieces of scrap wood behind the center, and every time he swung that hammer, I saw a piece of the future forming right there in his small, determined hands. One evening, when the center was empty, I found myself in the old storage room, what used to be my father's workshop. The floor still smelled faintly of sawdust. I reached into a box I'd kept hidden under the table and pulled out an envelope. Inside was the last piece of my past. Carter's signature on the original property transfer, the one that had started it all. I stared at it for a long time. The ink had faded, but the betrayal in that line still screamed at me. I walked outside, struck a match, and held it over a rusted tin can. The paper curled, blackened, then caught fire. The flame licked it clean until all that was left was ash. The night wind carried it away. Watching it burn, I felt lighter not because I'd destroyed something, but because I'd released it. That paper no longer owned me. It never would again. I walked back inside, locking the door behind me, the faint smell of smoke following me like a ghost turned to dust. That flame didn't destroy my past, it sealed it. I still keep the pen that ruined me in a box marked "Never Again." It sits on the top shelf of my desk, tucked between old receipts and a photograph of my father. The pen. The one I used to sign away everything that day. Its black barrel is scratched, the gold lettering faded. But I can't throw it out. It's not a souvenir, it's a reminder. A piece of the woman I used to be. Every time I see it, I remember what blind trust cost me, and what I had to become to earn my life back. Hartley Haven hums with life now. The building that was once broken like me has become a heartbeat for the town. Mornings start with laughter from the playroom, the sound of coffee being poured, the echo of women sharing stories that sound like mine used to. The walls are lined with photos, faces of mothers and children who've passed through these doors and left stronger. Sometimes I catch myself standing in the middle of it all, unable to believe it's real. The land my father left me, once stolen, is now more alive than it ever was. The apple tree Ella planted by the window has started to bear fruit. Mason built a wooden bench beneath it with help from Pete. He carved one word into the backrest. Home. That word used to hurt. Now it heals. I still visit my father's grave every Sunday. The drive out there takes me past the hills that cradle the town, through roads I once sped down, crying, screaming, begging for something to change. Now, the drive is quiet, peaceful. I bring him a cup of black coffee just the way he used to drink it and sit beside the stone, telling him about the center, about Ella's grades, about Mason's crooked smile when he hammers nails too fast. Dad, I tell him, tracing his name on the granite. I finally did it. I built something that lasts. The wind always seems to pick up then, brushing my hair back like his hand once did. I like to imagine that's his way of saying, "You did good, kid." Back at the center, I started something new, a small scholarship fund for young women rebuilding their lives. It's not much yet, but it's growing. Every dollar feels like redemption. Each form they fill out, each line they sign, I double-check for them. No one leaves without understanding every word. I made a promise. No woman under my roof will ever lose something to a piece of paper again. A few weeks ago, Denise stopped by with a set of legal documents. "It's time," she said, placing them on my desk. "Let's protect this place for good." She was talking about the land trust. A way to ensure Hartley Haven could never be sold, stolen, or claimed by anyone, not even me. Not without the consent of the board we built together. The irony wasn't lost on me. It began with a signature, and now it would end with one too. I read every line, twice. Then I looked at Denise and smiled. "You know, I used to think signing my name meant surrender. Now I know it means strength." She nodded. "It's the same act, Brynn, just a different woman holding the pen." The room was quiet except for the soft scratch of ink as I signed my name slowly, deliberately, owning every letter. When I was done, I pressed my hand over the page, sealing it in a way notary ever could. This wasn't just a document, it was a declaration. After Denise left, I walked out into the field. The sunset painted the sky in streaks of orange and gold, the kind my father used to call second chances in color. The apple tree's leaves whispered in the wind, and somewhere inside the center, someone started playing a piano. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who signed too fast, who trusted too easily, who let someone else define what she was worth. I mourned her once, Now, I thank her. Because without her mistakes, I would have never become this version of me. The one who knows that trust isn't given, it's earned. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in my office. The moonlight poured through the window, silvering the edges of the papers still drying on my desk. I opened the drawer and took out the pen. I held it in my hand one last time, the way you hold something that once hurt you but doesn't anymore. Then I placed it gently in the small wooden box I'd carved myself. The one labeled in bold black letters, "Never again." I locked it, set it on the shelf, and turned off the light. When I walked outside, the night air was cool and forgiving. The stars shimmered over the field where my children had once played in the dirt, and the wind carried the faint scent of apple blossoms. For the first time, the silence didn't scare me, it spoke to me. It told me I was free. The next morning, I found Ella sitting under the apple tree, sketching in her notebook. "What are you drawing?" I asked. She smiled. "The center? And you?" "Me?" "Yeah," she said. "I'm drawing you holding a pen." I laughed softly. "You sure that's a good idea?" She nodded, her pencil moving with certainty. "You're not afraid of it anymore." I looked at her so sure, so strong, and felt tears sting my eyes. She was right. I wasn't afraid. The pen, the papers, the lies, they didn't own me. I owned my story now. When she finished, she held the drawing up proudly. The lines were rough, the proportions off, but it was beautiful. "You forgot something," I said. "What?" "The box," I told her. "Put it on the shelf behind me." She grinned and started sketching again, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth the way her father's used to when he focused. And in that moment, surrounded by the sounds of morning and the promise of new beginnings, I felt peace, real, unshakable peace. I took one last deep breath, let it out slowly, and whispered to myself, "It's over. No more running, no more fear, no more stolen signatures. Because some signatures take everything, but the right one gives it all back."